Trail of Breadcrumbs, based on Hansel and Gretel by the Brothers Grimm, 1812. Deep in the heart of the woods lived a small household, a mother, a father, and their 2 young children. Gretel was the eldest of the 2, being 5 years older than her brother Hansel. The pair were inseparable. They were ever playing together and adored each other's company. The parents loved their babies with all their hearts, and despite their wealth decreasing day by day, they refused to abandon their children. Some days would be so bad that the family couldn't even eat, but still they kept their spirits high, knowing that no matter what, they would always have each other. Unfortunately, that sweet sentiment wasn't destined to last. The trees stared down on Gretel as she forced herself forward through the narrow slimmer of dawnlights that could reach her. She was searching for her brother. Her family was lost, and she had devoted all night seeking to locate Hansel. The parents' location was known. They were gone, but Hansel was still out there. He had to be. Gretel could not stop driving her feet through the leaves and the bark that envelops the earth until she had found him. Panic kept her moving. If it wasn't for the panic, she may have just given up on the pursuit altogether. Holding a moment to lean against the tough trunk of a tree, she glanced down to discover what appeared to be a breadcrumb. "Hansel!" Gretel choked as she compelled herself to the ground to examine. It was a breadcrumb, just a modest brown scrap of bread, no fatter than a thumbtack. As she looked up, she caught another, just feet away. She understood what this meant. Their parents had advised them. If ever you discover yourselves lost in the woods, set up a trail of breadcrumbs to help locate one another. Keep it beneath the shield of the trees, for you don't wish the fowl to have them before you. Gretel crept along the floor, not caring if it scratched her stockings up till her knees bled. The trail of breadcrumbs would bring her to her brother. It would bring her to hope. The trail looked to have no end. Gretel crawled and crawled for hours, perhaps even days. Her belly moaned, her mouth was parched, but still she crawled. She would find her brother, no matter the cost. As the sun touched noon, Gretel looked up to discover a cottage. It was a small cottage with a thatched roof, pleasant flower boxes on the windows, and an embracing wooden door. The trail of breadcrumbs had ended, and so she knew this was where her brother was. With all her energy, she forced herself up onto her legs and stumbled over to the nearest window. Gretel peeked inside and saw her brother resting at a dinner table, surrounded by baked goods. Gretel's stomach moaned as she saw them, but there was another feeling going on in her gut, a dreadful feeling. She scrambled to another window and peeked in to see a broom leaning against the backmost wall. Alarm bells rang in her head as she dashed back to the other window to see Hansel. Now he was weeping and holding his finger up. A woman entered view and gave the finger a slight pinch. "She's forcing him to eat so she can devour him. She's a witch!" Gretel cried before covering her mouth and hiding herself from view of the window. Thump, thump, thump went Gretel's heart as she plucked up the courage to have another glance through the window. Much to her surprise, Hansel was no longer crying. In fact, he looked quite content. The child was chomping down on some cake as he looked up to meet his sister staring back at him. He dropped his cake in excitement, and Gretel set about inviting him to flee. Hansel figured out what his sister was trying to say and shook his head in protest and fluttered his hand, beckoning Gretel in. Gretel couldn't accept it. Her brother was being kept prisoner by a witch, and yet he seemed as if he were right at home. "It's a spell," Gretel muttered to herself. "The witch has him under a spell." The girl stooped down out of sight and slunk gently to the door, placing a palm on the warm wood. She nudged it free, just enough to look inside. The feet of the witch shuffled back and forth between Hansel and the counter. "What is she up to?" Gretel whispered as she pressed the door open just enough to creep inside. As soon as she was in, she shot under the table and hid. Now the witch was in unobscured view, and Gretel could see she was decorating what looked to be gingerbread people. "Now, once you've spent your guggalumph, I shall present you some of this gingerbread." Gretel placed her hand over her mouth as she listened to the witch give a slight giggle. Hansel kicked his legs back and forth as he greedily gobbled up the last of a little cake. The witch headed over to the table with the plate of gingerbread people, setting it down with a clunk just above Gretel's head. "Eat up, dear. Don't be modest." The witch laughed as she headed over to the great oven. The second she opened the door, Gretel jumped out from under the table, making the witch shriek with fright. The witch settled her hand on her heart, allowing an exhale of relief. "Oh, Gretel dear, it's you." Gretel stepped back in consternation. She spun to face Hansel, who just grinned back at her. "Hag!" Gretel turned and spat at the witch. "You have him under a spell. Release him at once." Gretel's hands folded into fists as she frowned at the woman before her. "A spell, you propose?" The woman swanned over to Hansel, setting her hands on the back of his chair. "Hansel, my dear, are you under my spell?" Hansel shook his head as he prepared to take one of the gingerbread people from the plate. "No, Auntie Angelica, I'm not." Gretel relaxed her fist. "Auntie?" She placed her palm onto the coarse wooden tabletop. "That's right, dear. I'm your Auntie Angelica. My brother, your father..." Angelica wasn't certain what to say. What could she say to her grieving niece, considering that losing her parents was still a raw wound? "Your safety became my responsibility. As soon as I learned, I took Hansel back to my home, but we couldn't find you anywhere." Angelica closed her eyes in lament. "It was my plan to leave a trail of breadcrumbs. I made one every path we sought. We searched for you every day, sister." Hansel smiled, placing his cookie back onto the plate. The situation had overcome his appetite. "But the broom..." Gretel turned to her brother in desperation. "I saw you weeping. She..." Gretel pointed at Angelica. "Was checking to see if you were plump enough to eat." Angelica glanced over at her broom and cackled. "This..." She seized it with her left hand and raised it for Gretel to observe. "This is just a broom, to sweep the floors." Gretel narrowed her eyes, uncertain. "I received a splinter from the table," Hansel spoke up. "Auntie Angelica was just squeezing it out." The young woman glanced down at her palm. It had undeniably been scathed by the rough surface. Angelica put the broom back into place and dusted off her hands. "I don't believe you." Both Hansel and Angelica looked at Gretel in bewilderment. "What do you mean, dear?" Angelica gave an uneasy laugh. "If you're not a witch, then what's with all these confections you were giving my brother? Do you refute fattening him up to dine on him?" The girl was boiling red with impatience now. "Of course I deny it." Angelica gasped at the slight. "The boy is grieving. The least I could do is bake for him." The woman placed her right hand to her chest and reached out to Gretel with the left. "My beautiful, sweet child. The devil makes work for idle hands." "Devil?" Gretel tilted her head. Angelica laughed and waved the word off. "It's just a phrase. It doesn't mean anything." The woman retracted her hand as Gretel took a step closer to her. "No. You said devil," Gretel challenged. "Oh, come now, stop all this nonsense about witches and pull up a chair next to your brother." The woman was beginning to grow impatient, as if remembering his presence. Gretel turned to see Hansel, whose face was riddled with confusion. Gretel looked down at the plate of cookies before him. "What's in the cookies?" Gretel picked one of the gingerbread people up and waved it in front of her auntie. "Enough of this, Gretel. I will not be questioned in my own home. I understand you're feeling a great many things, but that's no excuse to treat me like this." Angelica's kind face was now turned stern. She wasn't taking any prisoners. "Treat you like what, witch?" Gretel snatched a plate of cookies from the table and hurled it across the room towards the oven. Gingerbread people flew everywhere, with most snapping apart once they hit the floor, and some falling into the oven, whose door Angelica had forgotten to close. Angelica looked down in horror at a piece of shattered plate on the floor. "That wasn't fair, Gretel." Hansel rose from his seat for the first time. Auntie Angelica has been nothing but kind to me since she came to collect us. Gretel couldn't believe her ears. Was Hansel really defending this woman? How did you find out about our parents? Gretel growled. This question proved to be the final straw for Angelica. She grabbed Gretel by the wrist and prepared to drag her outside. Unhand me! Unhand me! Gretel cried as her skin grew warmer to the touch. It grew so warm, in fact, that Angelica was forced to release the girl from her grip. Ouch! She cried as she rubbed her scalded hand. She looked back over to Gretel and was horrified to see her niece's eyes glow a burning amber. The door thumped shut behind Angelica. Gretel, what's happening to you? Hansel cried with concern. The girl didn't respond. She stood stoic, considering the woman before her. An intense orange light swirled around Gretel's exposed arms, defying all limits of nature. Whatever is going on with you, Gretel, we can resolve it together. Angelica raised her hands as she shuffled closer to Hansel. Resolve it? Resolve what, Angelica? You can't fix what you did to my parents. Hansel averted his gaze from his sister. What does she mean? He urged his aunt. Gretel, Hansel. The woman turned to each, searching for the right thing to say. Children. She took a heavy breath. I did nothing to your parents. She turned and peered into Gretel's golden eyes and smiled. Liar! Gretel screamed as she directed a wave of amber liquid towards Angelica. The woman struck her back against the oven as she sank onto her knees at Gretel's feet. Stop this, sister, please! Hansel begged as Angelica looked up defenceless. Gretel clocked the stove behind her aunt. If you like baking so much, perhaps we should bake you. She aimed another upsurge of amber at the woman, but it was deflected by the broom Hansel had just snatched. Brother, move aside. I'm doing this for your protection. Hansel refused to bend. Instead, he stayed in front of Angelica with every intention to shield her. Step aside, Hansel. I don't want to maim you. The siblings locked eyes. Nothing you do to me could ever hurt more than losing mother and father. A lump caught in Gretel's throat. She swallowed it down as she wailed a gut-wrenching cry fueled by grief. Her energy forced Hansel out of the way, flinging him against the wall with a crack. Angelica was thrust into the oven, the door closing before her. Gretel rushed over and set the stove alight as the shrieks of her auntie being burned alive could be heard ringing throughout the woods for miles around. Gretel collapsed to the ground and covered her ears, blocking out the howling. As they started to recede, she collected herself and searched the room for her brother. Her eyes met him lifeless, slumped against the wall. No, no, she cried, crawling towards him. I'm sorry, she crowed with her brother's limp head in her arms. As she dropped into place, her foot hit something on the floor. In anguish, she shifted to find a gingerbread person sleeping there, still intact. Gretel released her brother from her hold and reached for the biscuit, placing 2 of her fingertips to the gingerbread person's arm. She observed as her skin began morphing into gingerbread. The more gingerbread essence her body absorbed, the less alive she became. On the contrary, the biscuit she felt began wriggling into life, and as Gretel let go of the person, it shot off. The little cookie ran out the door. Gretel turned to her brother, now made of gingerbread. Stay with me, she choked as she took her brother's hand in hers and watched as that too also became gingerbread. His wounds healed over with icing. A sigh of relief swept over Gretel as she pulled her brother in for a tight hug. Don't worry, Hansel. I'll keep you safe. She pulled her hand free from him and settled it onto the floor. The witch is gone. It's just us 2 now. The ground Gretel touched also transformed into gingerbread, and it wasn't long before the entire cottage became a gingerbread house. The door sealed itself shut with icing. The gingerbread crept over the windows, plunging the room into darkness, until all that could be seen was Gretel's 2 glowing amber eyes, glued to her younger brother. Don't worry, brother. You are safe now. The witch has gone.